plane was ready for takeoff, and the passengers were slowly settling into their seats. The billionaire entered the cabin with quiet confidence, carrying only a small briefcase and an air of calm that came from years of handling high-pressure situations. He had traveled on countless flights before, but today felt different. Something in the atmosphere seemed tense, even before the incident occurred. He chose a seat near the middle of the plane, placing his belongings carefully on the overhead bin. Around him, passengers chatted softly or focused on their devices, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. The flight attendant, responsible for ensuring order in the cabin, had been having a tough day. Tired and on edge, she noticed the billionaire's approach with a mix of curiosity and impatience. Something about his demeanor rubbed her the wrong way. As the billionaire sat down, he politely requested assistance with storing his briefcase, keeping his tone calm and professional. The flight attendant, however, misinterpreted his request. She thought he was being demanding or disrespectful, and in a moment of impulse, she slapped him across the face. The action was swift, shocking everyone nearby. Passengers gasped, and some instinctively leaned forward to see what had happened. The billionaire froze for a moment, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but never had someone reacted so aggressively to a simple request. For a few seconds, the cabin was silent except for the soft hum of the airplane's engines. The tension was palpable. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden escalation, while others whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Despite the shock, the billionaire remained composed. He didn't yell or retaliate physically. Instead, he took a deep breath, keeping his hands relaxed and his posture steady. His mind was already calculating the next steps. Years of experience had taught him that reacting with anger rarely solved anything. The flight attendant, on the other hand, realized immediately that she had crossed a line. Her face turned red, and she stumbled over her words, trying to apologize, but the words came out awkward and tense. Passengers continued to murmur, some offering sympathetic glances to the billionaire, while others cast judgmental eyes toward the flight attendant. It was clear that everyone felt the weight of the moment. The situation could have spiraled out of control, but the billionaire's calm presence prevented further chaos. As the flight attendant stepped back, trying to regain her composure, the billionaire adjusted his seat and looked around the cabin. His gaze was steady, not threatening, but commanding respect. People noticed his calm demeanor and began to relax slightly, though the tension in the air remained. The incident had already left a mark on the mood of the cabin, and it was evident that this flight would be remembered by everyone on board. In the following minutes, the flight attendant tried to continue her duties, offering drinks and instructions to passengers, but her movements were less confident than before. The billionaire, meanwhile, remained seated, quietly observing. He noticed small details, the way passengers were watching, the reactions of the crew, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Every detail was important, and he absorbed it all with patience. Passengers who had initially been distracted by their phones or conversations now found themselves fully engaged in the scene. Some whispered to their neighbors, speculating about what might happen next. The suspense in the cabin was almost tangible. No one knew how the billionaire would respond, and that uncertainty added to the tension. As the plane ascended, the billionaire maintained his calm, almost meditative state. He was not angry, but he was aware. Awareness, he knew, was more powerful than reaction. The flight attendant occasionally glanced at him, uncertainty in her eyes, wondering if he would react in some dramatic way. The silence between them spoke volumes. Words were unnecessary. The tension was already understood by both parties. Outside the window, the sky was a deep, endless blue. The sun reflected off the wings, casting a warm glow into the cabin. The contrast between the serene view and the charged atmosphere inside was striking. Passengers glanced outside for comfort, but their attention inevitably returned to the unfolding situation. Everyone felt as if they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that went beyond a typical flight experience. The billionaire shifted slightly, opening his briefcase to retrieve a notebook. He began to write, not in a frantic manner, but deliberately, carefully. Each stroke of the pen was measured, thoughtful. He was planning, reflecting, and preparing. Even in such a tense moment, he found a way to maintain control and focus. The flight attendant, noticing this, felt a mix of fear and respect. It was clear that the billionaire's mind was several steps ahead, and she was unsure how to navigate the situation. Around them, the murmurs of the passengers continued, though more subdued now. Some had pulled out their phones, discreetly capturing what had happened, knowing that the story would travel far beyond the plane. Others simply watched, fascinated by the display of human behavior, the clash of impulsive action and calculated patience. Minutes passed, and the flight seemed to stretch indefinitely. The billionaire remained composed, a quiet force in the midst of chaos. Passengers began to notice that his calm was contagious. Even those who had been tense or fearful started to relax slightly, drawn in by his unshakable presence. The flight attendant's initial aggression now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the aura of control emanating from the billionaire. He glanced at the flight attendant once more, his eyes not angry but piercing, conveying a silent message. She understood immediately that this was not the end. The incident had consequences, though they would not be physical or loud. The billionaire's intelligence and experience would guide the next steps, and she would have to face them. The rest of the passengers, sensing the silent battle of wits, watched in anticipation. Conversations stopped, and even the background hum of the plane felt quieter. Everyone was drawn into the tension, waiting to see what would unfold next. The billionaire's presence had transformed the cabin into a stage, with each person playing their part in an unspoken drama. As the flight continued, the billionaire closed his notebook, leaned back in his seat, and allowed himself a small, controlled smile. It was not a smile of victory yet, but a signal of readiness. He was prepared for what would come, and he knew that the next moments would define the outcome of the conflict. The flight attendant, though still uneasy, began to realize that this was no ordinary passenger. She had underestimated him, and the realization brought a mix of fear and respect. The scene inside the cabin was a study in human behavior. Calm versus impulse, patience versus aggression, awareness versus reaction. Every passenger felt it, even if they could not articulate it. The incident had set the tone for the entire flight, and no one would forget it. As the hours ahead stretched before them, the billionaire remained a steady anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He did not need to raise his voice or act impulsively. His control of the situation was quiet but absolute. Passengers watched, captivated by the subtle drama unfolding in real time, knowing they were witnessing something remarkable. And in that moment, as the plane soared through the sky, the stage was set. The billionaire's calm had not only diffused immediate tension but had also prepared the ground for what was coming next. The flight attendant, once aggressive and impulsive, now realized that she was facing someone whose mind was as sharp as it was composed. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted irreversibly. Everyone sensed it. The story was far from over, and the billionaire was ready to respond in a way no one would forget. The flight continued smoothly, but the air in the cabin felt different. Every movement, every glance carried tension. The passengers were aware that something had happened, yet no one fully understood the depth of it. Some whispered quietly to the person next to them, speculating about the billionaire and the flight attendant. A few brave souls even tried to look back at the incident, hoping to catch another glimpse of what had unfolded. But the billionaire's calm posture made him appear almost untouchable. The flight attendant, meanwhile, attempted to maintain normalcy, but her confidence had been shaken. She offered drinks and safety instructions mechanically, her movements less fluid than before. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a tray. She avoided eye contact with the billionaire, fearing that he might retaliate at any moment. Deep down, she knew that this was no ordinary passenger, and every instinct told her to be careful. The billionaire, however, did not rush or panic. He leaned back slightly in his seat, observing everything in the cabin with keen attention. He noticed the subtle shifts in the passengers' reactions, the nervous laughter, the curious glances, the silent judgments. Every detail mattered. He understood that the flight attendant's aggression had set off a chain reaction, and how he responded would influence the entire atmosphere. Passengers who had initially been preoccupied with their devices or conversations were now fully engaged. Eyes darted between the billionaire and the flight attendant, trying to sense who would make the next move. Some held their breaths, anticipating conflict, while others tried to remain neutral. The quiet suspense was almost overwhelming, and the hum of the engines seemed louder than usual in contrast to the tension. The flight attendant's internal conflict grew. On one hand, she wanted to regain control and assert her authority. On the other hand, she feared that any wrong move could escalate the situation further. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to continue her duties. She served water and juice with careful precision, avoiding sudden gestures. Yet, she could feel the billionaire's eyes on her. Not in anger, but in observation. She realized that he was studying her just as she had studied him moments earlier. The billionaire, understanding the importance of patience, did not speak to her immediately. Words could inflame the situation. Instead, he focused on his own calm, steady breathing, projecting an aura of quiet authority. Passengers began to notice the difference between them. One person reacting impulsively, the other controlled and deliberate. This contrast made the incident more compelling and drew everyone deeper into the moment. A few passengers attempted to break the tension by engaging in small talk or asking simple questions about the flight, but the atmosphere was too heavy. Even casual conversations seemed forced and awkward. The billionaire responded politely but briefly, never losing his composure. His calmness had a subtle effect on those around him. Even the nervous flight attendant started to feel a small measure of restraint, realizing that rash actions would only make the situation worse. As the minutes passed, the billionaire quietly adjusted his seat, leaning slightly forward as if considering something important. He opened his briefcase and took out a pen and paper. With deliberate care, he began to jot down notes. The passengers noticed this, understanding that he was not merely a passive observer, but someone who was planning his next move carefully. The tension shifted slightly from fear to anticipation. People were now curious. What would he do next? The flight attendant occasionally glanced toward him, her uncertainty evident. She had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but she realized this was beyond her usual experience. This was not about rules or procedures. It was about human intelligence and the way one person could handle conflict with finesse. Every small movement she made was measured, and every glance she gave carried hesitation. The billionaire's silence had become a silent assertion of power. Other passengers were now fully invested in the scene. Some discreetly recorded small moments on their phones, while others simply watched. A sense of theater had entered the cabin. The billionaire's calm, the flight attendant's tension, and the passengers' curiosity combined to create a charged environment. Even those who tried to look away found themselves drawn back in, unable to ignore the unfolding situation. The billionaire shifted slightly, closing his briefcase after writing for some time. He leaned back and scanned the cabin, not with hostility, but with awareness. He was reading the room, understanding the emotions and reactions of those around him. He recognized that the flight attendant's impulsive action had been the spark, but the way he handled the aftermath would define the story for everyone present. The flight attendant, now fully aware of his attention, adjusted her approach. She continued her service, but with more caution. Every gesture was precise, every word carefully chosen. She knew that any misstep could escalate things further, and even in a professional environment, human emotions could shift dramatically in an instant. She realized she was not dealing with just any passenger. She was facing someone who could respond with intelligence and strategy, not force. Passengers continued to exchange quiet remarks. Some admired the billionaire's composure, others speculated on what he might do next, and a few even expressed concern for the flight attendant. The atmosphere was complex, layered with curiosity, admiration, fear, and respect. It was an unusual moment, one that would linger in the memory of everyone on the plane. The billionaire did not make any sudden moves. Instead, he remained patient, letting the situation unfold naturally. He understood that timing was crucial. Reacting too quickly or too slowly could undermine his position. His calm allowed others to observe, to reflect, and to anticipate what might happen next. The silence he maintained carried weight, communicating more than words ever could. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's mind raced. She replayed the moment of the slap over and over, questioning her actions and their consequences. She knew that the billionaire's next move would be significant, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Each time she looked at him, she felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. She realized that she was learning a lesson in patience, observation, and restraint from a person she had underestimated. Passengers continued to absorb the scene around them. Some were impressed by the billionaire's ability to stay calm under pressure, while others were fascinated by the psychological tension between him and the flight attendant. Every glance, every movement, every silence carried meaning. The incident had transformed the flight from a routine journey into an unforgettable human drama. Hours seemed to pass slowly. The billionaire maintained his composure, never allowing the situation to get out of control. He demonstrated the power of observation, patience, and strategic thinking. The flight attendant, despite her initial mistake, began to adjust to the unspoken rules of engagement. She moved carefully, aware of every step and gesture. The passengers watched, captivated by the subtle dance of human interaction. Eventually, the flight attendant paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and composing herself. She realized that she could not force control or dominate the situation. Respect, understanding, and careful observation were the only ways forward. She began to see the billionaire not as a target of her frustration, but as a teacher of patience and strategy. The billionaire, sensing the shift, remained observant but did not act aggressively. His goal was not to humiliate or punish, but to assert calm and intelligence in a high-pressure environment. He understood human behavior deeply, and his response was measured, strategic, and effective without being confrontational. Passengers, now fully engaged, could sense the subtle change. The tension was shifting from fear to respect, from uncertainty to acknowledgement of his composed approach. The flight continued, the engines humming steadily, but the cabin had transformed. What began as a sudden, shocking incident had become a study in human nature. The billionaire's calm, the flight attendant's adjustment, and the passenger's observation created a dynamic environment. Each moment built on the last, with anticipation growing for what might come next. Everyone sensed that the story was far from over, and the next steps would define the outcome. By the end of this part of the journey, it was clear that the billionaire had not only maintained control but had subtly shifted the balance of power. The flight attendant had learned the importance of observation and patience, while passengers had witnessed a remarkable display of calm under pressure. The atmosphere was charged, yet composed, with every individual aware that they were part of something extraordinary, a human drama that would linger in their memories long after the flight landed. The atmosphere on the plane had changed completely from the moment the slap had occurred. Tension had settled into a different rhythm, one that was quieter but heavier. Passengers who had been whispering nervously now watched intently, sensing that something was about to unfold. The billionaire remained calm, his presence steady and commanding without being loud or aggressive. Every passenger could feel it, even if they couldn't explain why. The flight attendant, still shaken from her impulsive action, tried to regain her composure. She moved carefully through the aisle, offering drinks and answering questions, but her movements were measured, almost cautious. She avoided direct eye contact with the billionaire, sensing that he was fully aware of her unease. His calm gaze seemed to analyze everything she did, and it carried a silent warning. Every action had consequences. For the billionaire, this was a moment to act with precision. He had spent years navigating high-stakes situations, learning that patience and strategy often spoke louder than force. He did not rush. He allowed the incident to breathe, letting the tension rise and settle as he considered his next move. He adjusted his posture slightly, relaxed his hands, and watched the reactions of the passengers and crew. Every detail mattered. The flight attendant noticed the change. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, judging her and the situation. Her heart raced, and a mix of fear and embarrassment washed over her. She realized that this was no ordinary passenger, and that any misstep could escalate the tension further. She focused on controlling her own movements, taking deep breaths, and following the proper procedures, all while being hyper-aware of the billionaire's presence. Passengers leaned forward subtly, curious about what would happen next. They whispered softly to each other, speculating about how the billionaire would respond. Some recorded the moment discreetly on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. There was a sense of anticipation that hung in the cabin like a quiet storm. Then, after 2 minutes of careful observation and strategic thought, the billionaire acted. He did not move aggressively or raise his voice. Instead, his response was calculated, deliberate, and subtle, but it immediately made an impact. The flight attendant's expression changed instantly. Her confidence wavered as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. She understood, too late, that this was not about physical retaliation but about strategy and intellect. The billionaire had issued a precise verbal correction, calm yet firm, that exposed the flight attendant's impulsive error without shaming her in front of everyone. His words were sharp but measured, carrying authority and intelligence. Passengers who had been tense with anticipation now felt a mix of admiration and awe. The billionaire had turned the situation on its head without raising his voice, and it was clear that his approach had been far more powerful than any physical response could have been. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she processed what had just happened. She realized that she had underestimated him, and the awareness brought a mix of fear, humility, and respect. She continued her duties, but each gesture was now carefully considered. Her previous confidence had been shaken, and she understood that this passenger had a sharp mind and a measured way of handling conflict. Passengers observed quietly, captivated by the unfolding drama. They noticed the subtle shifts in the flight attendant's posture, the careful attention of the billionaire, and the energy that seemed to ripple through the cabin. It was not a loud spectacle, but a quiet display of power and strategy that drew everyone in. Even those who had tried to distract themselves with their phones or books could not ignore the intensity. The billionaire leaned back slightly in his seat, exuding calm and composure. His focus was unshakable, and it sent a message to everyone on board. He was in control without being controlling. Passengers admired the restraint and thoughtfulness in his actions, realizing that true power often came from patience and intelligence rather than force. The flight attendant, now fully aware of the shift in dynamics, took a deep breath and attempted to regain composure. She served drinks carefully, avoiding sudden movements, and spoke in a calm, neutral tone when interacting with passengers. She realized that the billionaire had not only responded strategically but had also taught her a lesson in observation and patience. Each action she took was now informed by awareness, as she understood that the smallest misstep could have significant consequences. Passengers continued to watch, whispering softly among themselves. Some were impressed by the billionaire's intelligence, others by the subtle way he had asserted control, and a few reflected on the flight attendant's growth in response to the incident. The cabin had transformed into a stage for human behavior, with tension, strategy, and observation at the center. The billionaire noticed the passenger's attention. He did not seek it, but he acknowledged it subtly, understanding that his composed response had a ripple effect. The cabin was now quieter, more attentive, and filled with a mix of curiosity and respect. The energy was not chaotic but charged with anticipation, as everyone waited for what would come next. The flight attendant, feeling the weight of the moment, realized she had learned something important. She understood that impulsive actions could have far-reaching effects and that restraint and observation were critical in high-pressure situations. She continued her duties carefully, aware of the eyes on her and the presence of someone who could respond intelligently to any challenge. The billionaire, meanwhile, continued to observe and plan. He did not rush into the next action, understanding that timing was everything. His calm presence allowed him to control the atmosphere without force, and passengers and crew alike felt the impact of his composed strategy. The subtle display of authority and intelligence had left a mark on everyone in the cabin, a lesson in handling conflict with clarity and foresight. As the flight progressed, Small moments highlighted the contrast between impulsive reaction and calculated response. The flight attendant moved with caution. The billionaire remained observant and patient, and the passengers absorbed every detail. The tension had shifted from uncertainty and fear to anticipation and understanding. Everyone could sense that the situation was far from ordinary, and the billionaire's response had elevated the entire experience. Passengers now began to reflect quietly on the nature of power and influence. They noticed how the billionaire's calm demeanor and strategic actions had diffused tension while asserting control. Even in a confined space like an airplane cabin, intellect and patience proved to be more effective than force. It was a human lesson unfolding in real time, one that would leave a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. The flight attendant, now fully aware of the billionaire's composed approach, adjusted her behavior accordingly. She spoke more carefully, moved deliberately, and observed the passengers and crew with heightened attention. She understood that this encounter was a pivotal moment, one that required awareness and careful consideration. Each action she took was deliberate, informed by the lessons of restraint and observation. The passengers continued to watch, captivated by the subtle interplay of strategy and human behavior. Every glance, every gesture, every pause carried meaning. The scene had transformed into a silent drama, where intelligence and composure were the most powerful tools. The flight attendant's earlier impulsiveness had been corrected, not through force, but through careful, deliberate action by the billionaire. The billionaire remained calm, observing and planning. He understood that his role was not only to respond but also to maintain balance and ensure that the situation did not escalate unnecessarily. Passengers recognized the subtlety of his approach and began to appreciate the quiet authority he held. The cabin was charged, but the energy was controlled and focused, a testament to the power of thoughtful action over impulsive reaction. Minutes passed, and the flight seemed to stretch with the tension and anticipation. The billionaire's composed presence had become a focal point, drawing attention and commanding respect without force or aggression. The flight attendant, fully aware of the impact of her previous actions, continued with heightened awareness, adjusting her behavior carefully. Passengers remained engaged, understanding that they were witnessing something remarkable in human behavior. By the end of this part of the journey, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely. The tension from the slap had transformed into a study of strategy, patience, and awareness. The billionaire had responded decisively and intelligently, creating a balance of power that was subtle yet undeniable. The flight attendant had learned the importance of observation and restraint, while passengers had absorbed a quiet lesson in human interaction. The scene was unforgettable, a testament to the power of intellect, patience, and composure in the face of conflict. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the clouds, while the tension inside the cabin had reached a new level. Passengers were fully alert, their attention drawn to the silent but powerful dynamic between the billionaire and the flight attendant. The billionaire's calm demeanor had become magnetic, and even those who had been anxious or impatient earlier now felt drawn into the atmosphere he created. The flight attendant moved with careful precision. Every step she took, every word she spoke was calculated and deliberate. She had realized that the way she handled the situation now would define her credibility in front of both the passengers and the billionaire. Her initial impulsive act had created chaos, but her careful adjustments showed growth and awareness. She offered drinks and snacks with a soft smile, each gesture measured, acknowledging the need for diplomacy in high-pressure situations. Passengers whispered softly, observing the subtle interaction. They noticed the flight attendant's nervousness mixed with professional composure and the billionaire's quiet observation that commanded respect without raising his voice. The cabin felt like it had transformed into a theater, with every movement carrying meaning. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as the focus shifted to the unfolding drama. The billionaire, seated with perfect composure, watched the cabin carefully. His eyes were not threatening, but they held a sharpness that left no doubt about his awareness. He understood the situation fully and knew that his next steps could solidify the lessons being imparted. He leaned back slightly, fingers lightly tapping the notebook he kept on his lap, reviewing notes and planning subtle actions that would leave a lasting impact. Passengers could sense that something more was coming. It wasn't an outburst, a loud confrontation, or a dramatic gesture. It was calculated, measured, and subtle. The anticipation was almost tangible. Everyone leaned slightly in their seats, wanting to witness what would happen next. The energy was no longer anxiety. It was curiosity mixed with respect and awe. The flight attendant, aware of the shift in energy, adjusted her movements once again. She moved with care, avoiding sudden gestures, speaking calmly to passengers, and making sure she followed proper protocol. Her face showed a mixture of apprehension and concentration. She realized that the billionaire's response was not about humiliation but about making a point, showing that patience, awareness, and intelligence were far more powerful than impulsive action. The passengers watched quietly, some still whispering, others observing in silent fascination. They noted the contrast between the flight attendant's cautious adjustments and the billionaire's composed, almost effortless presence. Every interaction, every glance carried weight. The cabin had become an environment where subtle human behaviors played out like a live study in observation, patience, and strategic thinking. The billionaire finally spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but in a calm, clear voice that carried authority. His words were precise, acknowledging the flight attendant's position while highlighting the importance of careful action. The flight attendant listened intently, understanding that these words were not an attack but a demonstration of control and intelligence. Passengers were struck by the effectiveness of his response. It was powerful without being aggressive, and it commanded respect naturally. After a moment of silence, the flight attendant nodded slightly. Her face reflected a mixture of humility and realization. She understood the subtle lesson being communicated. Quick reactions and impulsive aggression rarely lead to favorable outcomes, but calm, deliberate strategy can have far-reaching effects. She continued her duties with renewed focus, her confidence restored but now tempered by awareness. Passengers who had been tense moments ago now relaxed slightly. The initial shock had transformed into a quiet admiration. They were witnessing a display of intellect and composure that was both rare and fascinating. Conversations resumed in low, careful tones, but everyone remained attentive to the main dynamic, the quiet interaction between the billionaire and the flight attendant. The billionaire observed everyone quietly, noting their reactions, and understanding that his composure influenced the mood of the cabin. He did not need to dominate or control. His calm had already shifted the energy. The passengers felt a mixture of respect and intrigue. They were learning, silently, from a human interaction that carried lessons far beyond a simple altercation. The flight attendant, now more confident yet still aware, served passengers with care and attentiveness. She noticed small gestures, the polite nods from some, the curious glances from others, and adjusted her approach accordingly. Her actions were precise, ensuring that every passenger felt attended to while maintaining awareness of the subtle power dynamic that had developed. Passengers who had recorded the initial incident discreetly put their phones away, realizing that the quiet lessons unfolding were even more valuable than capturing moments for social media. They absorbed the scene, appreciating the calm, intelligent response and the human growth taking place in front of them. The billionaire took a deep breath and closed his notebook briefly, scanning the cabin again. His eyes moved deliberately, observing the passengers, the crew, and the subtle changes in the flight attendant's posture. Each observation informed his understanding, allowing him to maintain a steady presence that influenced the energy in the cabin. He did not need to assert dominance through loud words or actions. His intelligence and patience spoke for themselves. The flight attendant, recognizing the effect of his presence, continued to adjust her behavior. Her movements were careful but fluid, her words calm but professional. She began to feel a sense of control returning, not over the passenger, but over her own actions and awareness. The experience had changed her approach, teaching a subtle but important lesson in observation, patience, and careful response. Passengers whispered to one another softly, discussing the subtle strategies at play. They were fascinated by the interaction, noting how a tense incident had transformed into a quiet display of intelligence, patience, and human awareness. Some admired the billionaire's composed handling, while others reflected on the flight attendant's growth and adaptation. The cabin had become a lesson in human behavior, witnessed in real time. The billionaire remained calm, adjusting his posture slightly, allowing moments of silence to stretch between words and actions. He understood that the tension had shifted and that the flight attendant had begun to learn the subtle dynamics at play. His approach did not humiliate or dominate. It guided, influenced, and corrected without aggression. Passengers noted the transformation, understanding the quiet power of strategic human behavior. The flight continued, cutting through the clouds, but the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had begun as a sudden act of impulsive aggression had evolved into a display of intelligence, restraint, and human observation. Passengers absorbed the scene, noticing the careful dance between caution, strategy, and composure. The flight attendant, fully aware of the lessons being demonstrated, continued her duties with renewed understanding. She moved with precision, her words measured, and her actions deliberate. She recognized the importance of awareness and careful strategy, understanding that this encounter had taught her lessons she would not forget. Passengers continued to observe, engaged and fascinated by the quiet but powerful dynamic. The billionaire had shown that true influence came from composure and intelligence rather than force or impulsive action. The flight attendant had adjusted, learning from her mistakes and demonstrating growth. The cabin felt transformed, with every person witnessing a remarkable display of human behavior. By the end of this segment of the journey, it was clear that the billionaire's calm, deliberate response had shifted the energy in the cabin entirely. The flight attendant had learned the importance of careful observation and strategic patience, while passengers had absorbed an unspoken lesson in human interaction and influence. The atmosphere was now charged with respect, awareness, and understanding, and the story was far from over. Everyone on board sensed that the next actions would continue to shape the narrative, leaving a lasting impression on all who had witnessed the extraordinary unfolding of calm strategy in the midst of tension. The final leg of the flight began, and the atmosphere in the cabin was markedly different from the moment the billionaire had boarded. The earlier slap and the tension it caused had transformed into a quiet understanding, a lesson in patience, strategy, and observation that everyone on board seemed to feel. Passengers were more attentive, not out of fear, but out of respect for the calm and intelligence that had unfolded before them. The flight attendant moved carefully through the aisle, her posture more confident but tempered by awareness. She offered drinks and snacks with precision, ensuring that her actions were deliberate and considered. Every word she spoke carried care, and every glance was measured. She had learned a subtle but powerful lesson about human behavior, restraint, and strategic awareness. This awareness influenced not only her actions but also the overall mood in the cabin. Passengers observed quietly, some still whispering softly, others merely watching in silent fascination. They noted the transformation in the flight attendant's approach, the steady calm of the billionaire, and the way the cabin had shifted from tension to a form of collective focus. It was as if everyone had become a participant in a lesson about human interaction, patience, and intelligence. The billionaire, seated with composure, remained quietly observant. He did not need to speak or act aggressively. His presence alone carried authority. He understood that human reactions were often impulsive, and the best responses came from calm observation and measured action. He scanned the cabin, noticing the subtle expressions on passengers' faces, the careful movements of the flight attendant, and the overall energy of the room. Each observation informed his understanding and guided his continued approach. The flight attendant, now fully aware of his awareness, moved with a new sense of responsibility. She carefully followed protocol, spoke calmly to passengers, and adjusted her behavior based on the lessons she had absorbed. She had learned that quick, impulsive actions could create chaos, while patience, awareness, and strategic observation allowed one to regain control and respect. Passengers continued to watch quietly. Some admired the billionaire's calm and intelligence. Others reflected on the subtle ways in which he had shifted the balance of power without aggression. A few whispered to their neighbors, noting how remarkable it was to witness someone maintain such composure under pressure. The cabin had become a space of learning and observation, where the interactions between a passenger and crew demonstrated lessons that extended far beyond the flight itself. The billionaire, aware of the attention he was drawing, continued to maintain his calm. His actions were deliberate and measured. He adjusted his seat slightly, writing small notes in his notebook, and observing the cabin with steady attention. His quiet authority had a tangible effect on the atmosphere, and passengers could feel the difference. The tension that had once existed had transformed into a sense of order, focus, and understanding. The flight attendant, sensing the shift, responded with careful precision. She offered assistance where needed, moved deliberately through the cabin, and interacted with passengers with a calm professionalism. Her nervousness had been replaced by awareness, and she now understood the impact of strategic, thoughtful action. Every gesture she made reflected the lessons she had learned from the billionaire's composed response. Passengers observed the interaction, recognizing the subtle but powerful dynamics at play. The incident had started as a sudden act of aggression, yet it had evolved into a demonstration of patience, intelligence, and strategic awareness. Everyone in the cabin could feel the quiet power of observation and composure, and the lesson was not lost on them. The human drama had transformed into a silent display of influence and control. The billionaire leaned back in his seat, allowing moments of silence to stretch naturally. He did not seek attention or dominance. His strategy was subtle, yet it was effective. The flight attendant, aware of the magnitude of the moment, continued her duties with careful attention. Each movement, each word, and each gesture was informed by awareness and understanding. Passengers absorbed the scene quietly, recognizing the extraordinary calm and intelligence displayed. Time seemed to stretch as the flight approached its final destination. Passengers remained engaged, their curiosity and admiration evident. The flight attendant moved through the cabin with care, ensuring that every interaction was thoughtful and precise. The billionaire's composed presence influenced the energy in the cabin, creating a sense of order, focus, and quiet respect. The flight attendant occasionally stole a glance at the billionaire, acknowledging his calm without words. She understood that he had transformed the situation, not through force, but through intelligence, patience, and strategic observation. The passengers noticed the subtle change as well, appreciating the way human behavior and composure had reshaped the entire environment. The billionaire, sensing that the lesson had been absorbed, allowed a small, subtle smile. It was not a smile of victory, but a quiet acknowledgement of the impact his presence had had. Passengers felt a sense of completion, recognizing that the drama had reached a resolution without escalation. The flight attendant, now fully composed, continued her work with confidence and awareness, demonstrating the growth she had experienced. The cabin remained quiet, but the energy was different. Passengers were no longer tense or uncertain. Instead, they were attentive and reflective. They had witnessed a human drama unfold that demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. The billionaire had responded to aggression not with anger, but with calm, controlled intelligence, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere was filled with a quiet respect. Passengers adjusted their seats and prepared for landing, still reflecting on what they had witnessed. The flight attendant moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of professionalism, aware of the lessons she had learned and the impact they had on the passengers and crew. The billionaire, composed as ever, reviewed his notes briefly before closing his notebook. His calm had been a lesson in itself, demonstrating that the right approach in tense situations was not impulsive reaction but thoughtful, measured action. Passengers continued to observe quietly, absorbing the lessons in human behavior, awareness, and strategic composure. As the plane touched down smoothly, the passengers prepared to disembark. The flight attendant had regained her confidence, tempered with the awareness and lessons from the encounter. The billionaire remained seated until the last moment, rising calmly and collecting his belongings. His presence had left a subtle but profound impact on the cabin, transforming what could have been a moment of chaos into a powerful lesson in human behavior. Passengers filed out of the plane, still discussing quietly what they had witnessed. They reflected on the calm, strategic response of the billionaire and the growth of the flight attendant. The atmosphere had shifted from tension and fear to understanding and respect. Everyone who had observed the incident recognized the importance of patience, awareness, and thoughtful action. The flight attendant, now more confident and composed, thanked passengers and completed her duties with a sense of accomplishment. She had learned the power of observation, restraint, and strategic response. The billionaire's quiet, intelligent approach had reshaped the cabin, leaving a lasting impression not only on her, but also on every passenger. Passengers left the plane with stories to tell and lessons learned. They had seen firsthand how calm, deliberate action could transform tense situations. The billionaire had demonstrated the power of patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. The flight attendant had learned to balance confidence with awareness. Together, they had created a human drama that would be remembered long after the flight had ended. As the plane emptied, the impact of the incident lingered. Passengers continued to reflect on the lessons in composure and human behavior. The flight attendant walked down the aisle with newfound poise, and the billionaire stepped off the plane quietly, leaving behind an atmosphere transformed by intelligence, patience, and calm authority. Everyone who had witnessed the events would carry the memory of this extraordinary lesson in human interaction for a long time. In the end, the billionaire's response had been a model of calm and strategic action, showing that intelligence and observation could resolve conflicts without aggression. The flight attendant had grown from the experience, learning the importance of awareness and patience. The passengers had been drawn into a real-life story of human behavior, one that demonstrated the profound effect of composed, thoughtful action in moments of tension. The story ended not with chaos, but with understanding, respect, and a quiet, lasting impression on all who had experienced it.